My son said that to me in the kitchen I had scrubbed every morning for 3 years. I smiled, picked up my suitcase, and waited for the black car. My son told me to leave on a Sunday in March, and I smiled at him. Not a polite smile, not the tight, practiced smile of a woman swallowing pain she can't afford to show. A real one, slow and steady, the kind that starts somewhere behind your sternum and rises on its own terms. He wanted tears. He wanted begging. He wanted the frail old woman he had decided I was to crumple in front of him so that he could feel generous about the nursing home brochures he'd left on the kitchen table, fanned out like a hand of cards. I looked at my son, my David, my boy, the one I had carried and fed and driven to soccer practice and sat beside through fevers and homework and heartbreaks, and I smiled at him the way you smile at someone who has just made a very serious mistake and doesn't know it yet. All right, I said, I'll pack. His face went white. That was not the reaction he had prepared for. Good. Part 1. What I gave. Let me tell you who I was before that Sunday, because the story doesn't make sense without it. My name is Catherine Marsh. I am 67 years old. For 31 years, I sewed wedding dresses out of a small atelier on Brennan Street in the city. Not a shop, exactly. More of a set of rooms above a florist where brides came by appointment and left, eventually, in tears of a different kind than the ones they arrived with. I was good at my work. Not famous, not wealthy. Good. The kind of good that builds itself slowly, stitch by stitch, and earns its own reputation through word of mouth and the particular satisfaction of watching a woman stand in a mirror and recognize herself for the first time. My husband Albert died 8 years ago. He was a businessman, a quiet, principled man who built his consulting firm from scratch and who, in 34 years of marriage, never once made me feel like a burden. His business partner was a man named Henry Montgomery, and I mention Henry now because he matters later, very much. After Albert died, I kept working for 5 more years. Then my hands began to ache in the way hands do when they've been holding needles for 3 decades, and I made the decision that felt, at the time, like generosity. I would sell the atelier, take the apartment money, and move in with my son. $180,000, every cent. For the family, I said, and handed David the check across his kitchen table. He folded it without looking at it. I told myself that was just how David was. Unsentimental, practical. Albert had been the same way, I thought. I had confused efficiency with wholeness in Albert, too, in the beginning. I was wrong about the comparison, but I wouldn't understand that for a while. The house was large and new. 4 bedrooms in a quiet suburb, double garage, a kitchen with granite countertops that Emily had selected from a catalog and described more than once as magazine-worthy. My room was off the back hallway. No window. A single overhead bulb and a closet so narrow I had to turn sideways to reach the back of the rod. They called it the guest room. I called it what it was, a storage closet with a cot in it. I did not complain. Emily, my daughter-in-law, David's wife of 9 years, was a woman of precise appetites and zero ambiguity about what she wanted from a situation. Within a week of my moving in, the terms were established without being spoken. I would cook, clean, iron, and manage the children. In exchange, I would be permitted to live in the storage room and eat at the table I had cooked for. No money changed hands, no thanks were given. The transaction was so clean and efficient that I had to admire it in a bleak kind of way. Since you're not working anymore, Emily said, with the bright, dismissive energy of a woman who has already made every decision and is merely notifying you, you can help with the house. Fair trade, I said. Of course. There were 2 children. Lily, 7, who had Albert's eyes and a gap in her front teeth and who used to crawl into my lap and ask me to tell her about the brides I had dressed. And Marcus, 4, who called me Grandma Cat and smelled like soap and trouble. I loved those children completely and without reservation. They were, for the first year, the reason I stayed. The ironing was not what broke me. The cooking wasn't either. What broke me, slowly, was the invisibility. Emily spoke to me the way people speak to background noise, without looking up, without expecting an answer that required attention. David, when he was home, moved through rooms where I was present as if the space were empty. I would set dinner on the table and they would sit down and begin eating and talking about their day without acknowledging that food had appeared, that someone had prepared it, that the kitchen they were seated in had been scrubbed clean that morning by a pair of hands that ached in the cold. I told myself it was gratitude, expressed differently. I told myself I was useful, and usefulness was its own dignity. I told myself a great many things that kept me functional and kept me quiet, right up until the night I couldn't sleep and went downstairs for a glass of water and heard Emily's voice floating from the living room. Part 2. The railing. It was 1:15 in the morning. The house was dark except for the blue television light leaking under the living room door. Emily was on the phone. I could tell by the rhythm of her pauses, the way her voice had that private, slightly elevated quality people use when they're performing for an audience. I had just reached the bottom of the stairs. My hand was on the railing. Just a few more months, she said, and then she'll be in the home. I'll turn her room into my walk-in closet. I did not move. She laughed. It was a bright, uncomplicated laugh, entirely without guilt. David does whatever I say. Weak men are so easy. I stood there for perhaps 30 seconds. My fingers had gone white around the railing. The cold of the wood pressed into my palm. I measured my breathing very carefully, the way I had learned to do during the months after Albert died, when grief arrived without warning and needed to be managed rather than expressed. Then I turned around and walked back up the stairs. I did not pour myself any water. I sat on the edge of my cot in the dark room with no window, and I thought about what I had had heard, and I thought about what I had given: the apartment money, the cooking, the ironing, the 3 years of 6 a.m. mornings and Sunday lunches for 8 people, and watching Lily and Marcus while Emily had her nails done. And I thought about how much of it had been love, and how much of it had been fear dressed up as love, afraid of losing my son, afraid of being alone. Those are not small fears. I want to be honest about that. Anyone who has been 64 and widowed and newly dependent on the goodwill of someone who has already decided how they feel about you will understand exactly what kind of fear that is. It is not weakness. It is not stupidity. It is a very reasonable response to having very few options, but it was still fear, and fear had made me useful to them. I stayed quiet. For 11 more months, I stayed quiet because I had no money, no apartment, and nowhere to go. Because David was my son, and I still believed, somewhere beneath the evidence, that this was a season and not a condition. Because I was old and tired, and the storage room was warm enough in winter, but I started paying attention differently. Part 3. What I noticed around the 4-month mark after that night on the stairs, I started noticing small things. The first was financial. David managed all the household accounts. He had, since Albert died, also nominally managed the estate paperwork, the investment accounts, the various holdings that Albert had left behind. I had trusted this completely, in the way you trust a person you raised. David was responsible. David was organized. David had his father's head for numbers. I started asking questions, not confrontational ones, small, casual ones, offered over breakfast or while I was folding laundry. How is the investment portfolio doing? Did the accountant file everything from last year? David had a specific way of answering questions he didn't want to answer. He'd respond to the question adjacent to the one I'd ask, efficiently and with complete detail, in a way that felt like information while providing none. I noticed that. The second thing was Henry Montgomery. Henry had called me twice in the past year, once on my birthday, once at Christmas. Both times David had answered the house phone. I did not have a mobile number at the time, something I had not thought to address after Albert died, and told Henry I was out. Both times I had been sitting 10 feet away in the kitchen, shelling peas or reading. David never mentioned the calls. I found out about them because Henry, being Henry, methodical, precise, 72 years old, and a man who wrote letters rather than texts because he had grown up when letters mattered, sent me a card, handwritten: "Catherine, I've tried to ring twice. I have something important to discuss. Please call." He included his private number. David intercepted the card. I know this because Lily found it, months later, in the back of the drawer where David kept takeaway menus, and brought it to me because she thought it was pretty paper. She was right. Henry had used cream-colored stock. I memorized the number. I said nothing. The third thing was the morning I found the file. David kept his home office locked, had since we moved in together, which I had accepted as a professional boundary. But in February, 2 months before the Sunday in March, he left for work without locking the door. I noticed because the door swung a few inches open when Lily ran past it in the hallway. I went in to close it, and on his desk, in a manila folder with my name written on the tab in David's handwriting, was a single sheet of paper, a signature authorization form from Montgomery Holdings, dated 2 years earlier. My name was signed at the bottom in ink I did not recognize as mine. I stood very still for a long time. Then I took my phone, I had bought one quietly, using money saved from grocery change, and I photographed every page in the folder, 12 in total. I put the folder back exactly as I had found it. I closed the office door. I went to the kitchen and started making lunch. My hands were absolutely steady. That surprised me. Part 4. The calls I made alone. There is a public library 4 blocks from the house. I went on Tuesdays when Lily was at school and Marcus was at nursery and Emily was at the salon. I told Emily I was walking for my health. This was not entirely untrue. I used the library computer to search the name Montgomery Holdings. I found press releases, a board page, archived filings. I found Henry's direct office line, which matched the number from the card. I called him from the library payphone. Yes, some libraries still had them in the foyer, at least they did in our town, on a Tuesday in February. Henry answered on the second ring. When he heard my voice, he was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then he said, "Catherine, where are you? Are you safe?" I told him I was at the library. I told him I had found the folder. I told him what was in it. The silence on his end was longer this time. "I need to meet with you," he said. "Not on the phone, in person." "I know," I said. "I'm going to send a car. Tell me when." "March," I said. "When the time comes, I'll call you." Part 5. The professionals. I want to be precise about this section because it is the part where I stopped being afraid and started being deliberate. In the 3 weeks between the library call and the Sunday in March, I made 4 appointments. The first was with a woman named Margaret Calloway, a forensic document examiner at a firm called Calloway Forensics and Consulting. 30 years of experience, primarily in estate fraud and will contestation. I sent her the photographs from my phone by email using the library's guest account. She called me back within 48 hours. "The signature on the authorization form is a very skilled forgery," she told me, speaking with the flat, technical precision I find deeply reassuring in professionals. "The pressure pattern is inconsistent with natural signing. The loop formation in your surname is copied, not organic." She paused. "This is your son's handwriting. Adjusted. I'd stake my certification on it." I wrote down everything she said, word for word. The second appointment was with a solicitor named James Okafor of Okafor and Associates, estate and financial litigation, 23 years in practice. Henry had referred him. I met James at a coffee shop 7 blocks from the house, carrying only my phone and a printed copy of the photographs. He reviewed them for 4 minutes without speaking. Then he said, "If what Mr. Montgomery is prepared to confirm is accurate, we are looking at estate fraud, forgery, and breach of fiduciary duty. The criminal exposure alone is significant." He looked up. "How much are we talking about?" "I don't know the full amount yet," I said. "Henry is compiling that. When you know," James said, "call me before you call anyone else." He gave me his personal mobile number. The third call was to a detective, specifically a man named Robert Fenn at the Financial Crimes Unit of the City Police Department. Henry had spoken to him first, as a courtesy and to establish context. Detective Fenn had 19 years on the force, 12 of them in financial crimes, and he spoke with the compressed efficiency of someone who had heard many versions of the same story and needed only the facts. "If the forensic examiner's conclusion holds, and Mr. Montgomery's documentation confirms the transaction," he told me, "we can move, but we wait until you have everything in order. Premature contact gives him time to move assets." "I understand waiting," I said. The fourth call I made was to no one official. It was to my own memory. I sat in the library on a Tuesday afternoon in late February and wrote down in a blue spiral notebook every incident I could remember from the past 3 years, every dismissal, every overheard conversation, every meal I cooked that went unthanked, every phone call David had intercepted, every morning in the storage room. Not for a court, not for a lawyer, for myself. Because the danger, when you are old and dependent and have been quietly treated as invisible for years, is that you start to believe the version of yourself that the people around you have decided you are. You start to forget that you built something, that you were someone. Writing it down was how I remembered. Part 6, Sunday. The morning of the Sunday in March was cold and gray, a light frost on the garden. I had made porridge for the children and a full-cooked breakfast for David and Emily, because Sunday was still Sunday in my kitchen, regardless of what was coming. David walked in around 10 o'clock, wearing the frown his father used to give him when he was lying. It was hereditary, apparently. That particular tightening around the jaw that David had never learned to control, because he had never needed to. "Mom," he said, "we need to talk." I set down my dish towel. "The house feels cramped," he said. "The kids are getting bigger. I've been thinking, maybe it's time you found somewhere more suitable." "You mean a nursing home? An upscale assisted living community? They're actually You're trying to get rid of me." Something shifted in his face. The rehearsed version of this conversation, the gentle, gradual version, the one where he was the reasonable son making a sensible suggestion, collapsed. What was underneath it was simpler and uglier. He raised his voice. "Get out of my house." The words came back off the walls I had painted the previous autumn at Emily's request. A warm grayish, 2 coats, because the first was uneven. Emily's hand came up to cover her mouth in the living room doorway, but not quickly enough to hide the smirk beneath it. Something broke inside me. Not my heart. My heart had been breaking in increments for 3 years. What broke was the last thin thread of the story I had been telling myself. That my son loved me and was simply weak. That he would eventually come back to himself. He would not. He was exactly who he had chosen to be. I looked at him. I felt my face settle into the expression I had been saving. I smiled. "All right, David, I'll pack." Part 7, the suitcase. I was upstairs for 45 minutes. I folded every blouse, every dress I had sewn with my own hands. I tucked the photographs into the side pocket of my leather suitcase, the one I'd had since Albert and I went to Vienna for our 25th anniversary. Albert on our wedding day, David as a baby in my arms, Lily and Marcus at Christmas, because I was taking those too. I did not cry. I thought about crying. I tried to locate the place in my chest where grief was supposed to pool, and I found that it was occupied by something else, something cooler and more precise, the particular calm that descends when a long-dreaded thing has finally arrived and there is nothing left to brace for. I took my blue spiral notebook from under the mattress. I took the phone. I carried the suitcase downstairs. David and Emily were on the couch, the one I had bought 3 months after moving in, when the old one's springs went and no one could agree on a replacement until I simply ordered one. They sat with matching expressions of relief that they were trying to disguise as neutrality. The nursing home brochures were still fanned on the table. Neither of them looked at me directly. The doorbell rang. David answered it with the sigh of a man who considers every interruption a personal inconvenience. He opened the door and stopped. A black limousine sat at the curb, not a car service. A limousine, long and dark, with a uniformed driver who was currently holding the rear door open and stepping through my garden gate, moving with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had never needed to rush toward anything in his life, was Henry Montgomery, 72 years old, silver-haired, dressed in a charcoal overcoat that had cost more than David's monthly salary. He walked up the porch steps past my son as if David were a decorative feature of the architecture. He looked at me. "Catherine," he said warmly, "are you ready?" I picked up my suitcase. I turned to David. His face was the color of the frost on the garden. Emily had come to stand in the living room doorway, her red nails pressed together in front of her, her expression no longer containing any smirk at all. "Thank you for everything," I said. "The house is all yours." I walked past my son, out the door, down the porch steps, into the clean March air. Part 8, the car. The limousine was warm inside, and it smelled faintly of the pipe tobacco Henry had given up 15 years ago, but whose scent had apparently never fully left the leather seats. I set my suitcase on the floor and sat very straight, the way my mother taught me, because posture is what you have when everything else is in flux. Henry waited until we had turned the corner before he spoke. "Catherine, there is something you need to know about Albert's will." My breath came in carefully. "David told you everything belonged to him." Henry looked at me steadily. He lied. The city slid past the window. A woman walking a dog. A man unlocking a cafe. The ordinary texture of Sunday morning moving past like scenery. 40% of Montgomery Holdings was placed in a protected trust for you. Albert was specific. He knew David was impulsive with money and he wanted you provided for independently. Henry paused. David forged your signature 2 years ago on a transfer authorization. He liquidated the full position. I said, "How much?" $1,680,000. The silence in the car was of a particular quality. Not empty, but full. Full of 3 years of porridge and ironing and storage rooms and overheard laughter. Full of $180,000 handed across a kitchen table without hesitation. Full of the check David had folded without looking at it. "How much does he think I know?" I asked. Henry met my eyes. "Nothing." I turned back to the window. Somewhere below the surface of my composure, something vast and cold was moving. The full comprehension of what had been taken, what had been planned, how long it had been in motion while I scrubbed floors and bathed grandchildren and smiled at mealtimes. "Good," I said. Then let's keep it that way. For now. Part 9. What came after. The formal investigation opened on a Wednesday, 11 days after I left the house. Detective Robert Fenn, Financial Crimes Unit, 19 years on the force, filed the initial report with documentation provided by Henry's legal team at Montgomery Holdings, corroborated by Margaret Calloway's forensic analysis of the signature, and supported by the transaction records that James Okafor had subpoenaed through civil discovery. The case was, in Fenn's words when he called to update me, clean. He used that word specifically, clean, by which he meant documented, evidenced, and without the ambiguity that defense attorneys use to construct doubt. David was arrested on a Thursday morning, at his home, in the kitchen with the magazine-worthy granite countertops. I was not present. I didn't need to be. James Okafor filed the civil suit concurrently: estate fraud, forgery, breach of fiduciary duty, and conversion of trust assets. The total claim was $1,862,000, which accounted for the $1,680,000 in liquidated trust assets plus the $180,000 I had given from the apartment sale, which Okafor argued had been solicited under false pretenses, given that David had already forged the documents and knew the trust existed. Emily retained a separate solicitor within 48 hours of the arrest. She was not charged. There was insufficient evidence to establish her direct participation in the forgery, though Fenn told me carefully that the investigation remained open on that question. She filed for divorce 6 weeks later. The house, which had been purchased, I learned, using a portion of the liquidated trust funds as a down payment, was subject to asset freezing pending the civil case. Emily and the children moved to her mother's property in the interim. I thought about Lily and Marcus a great deal during this period. Part 10. What I did with the time. Henry offered me the guest suite in his house on Alderman Hill, and I stayed there for 6 weeks while James navigated the immediate legal landscape. The room had 3 windows, and a view of a garden that was just beginning to open in early April, and I sat in the morning light with my coffee and my blue notebook, and did a great deal of thinking about the nature of love that mistakes itself for fear. I was not happy in those weeks. I want to be honest about that. Justice, when it arrives, does not retroactively heal the years that required it. I had lost 3 years I could not have back. I had lost the version of my son that I had believed in longer than the evidence warranted. I had lost the clean, uncomplicated grandmother relationship I should have had with Lily and Marcus, which had instead been conducted in the context of servitude and conditional tolerance. What I was, instead of happy, was clear. A woman named Dr. Susan Halverson, a therapist specializing in elder trauma and family estrangement, recommended by Henry's own doctor, met with me weekly beginning in April. She had a direct, warm manner and the useful habit of naming things precisely. In our 3rd session, she said, "You spent 3 years confusing loyalty with compliance. They feel the same from the inside, but produce very different outcomes." I wrote that down. It was the most useful sentence anyone said to me that year. Henry and I had dinner every Sunday. He told me about Albert, things Albert had said in the last months of his life, things Henry had held quietly for 8 years because he hadn't known how to deliver them. Albert had known David was reckless with money. Albert had arranged the trust specifically, Henry said, because he didn't trust David with my security. He loved the boy, Henry said, but he loved you more. I cried at that, which surprised me. The tears that hadn't come in the storage room, or on the stairs at 1:15 in the morning, or on the porch with my suitcase, they came over Sunday dinner, quietly, without drama. Henry pretended to look out the window until I was done. That was kindness, the real kind. Epilogue. A year later, the criminal case concluded 14 months after the arrest. David pleaded guilty to 2 counts of fraud and 1 count of forgery. He was sentenced to 18 months, with provision for supervised release, and ordered to make full restitution. His solicitor argued for mitigation on grounds of financial pressure and marital influence. The judge, a woman named the Honorable Patricia Dowd, whom I mention because she deserves it, was unmoved. The civil settlement recovered $1,140,000. Not everything. Legal fees, asset depreciation, and the particular mathematics of partial recovery meant it was not whole justice. James Okafor told me gently that it rarely was. I told him I already knew that. I used a portion of the settlement to lease a small studio on Brennan Street, not the original atelier, which had been renovated into a dental office, but a space 2 doors down that had the same same light in the afternoon. I do not sew professionally anymore, but I sew for myself. I finished a quilt last November that I had started in the storage room, in secret, in the evenings when no one was interested in what I was doing. Lily calls me on Sundays. Emily, to her credit, has never discouraged it. Marcus still calls me Grandma Cat, though he is 6 now and very serious about dinosaurs, and mostly wants to tell me facts about the Cretaceous period. I let them talk. I write it all down. David wrote me a letter from the minimum security facility where he is serving his sentence. He said he was sorry. He said he didn't know how it had happened, how he had become the kind of person who would do what he did. I read the letter twice. I folded it carefully. I put it in the same leather suitcase that came with me to Vienna in 1987 and out of the house on that Sunday in March. I have not yet decided what to do with it. Maybe I won't need to decide. Maybe some things don't require a resolution, only a witness. Albert built something for me, quietly, in the background, without telling me. He knew me well enough to know I would resist it if he offered. He arranged it so that even if everything else went wrong, I would not be without ground to stand on. He was right. He usually was. David thought he had won on that Sunday morning. He sat on that couch in a house built partly with stolen money and watched his old mother carry her suitcase down the stairs. And every calculation he had made told him that the story was over. He had no idea I was already holding the match. He just didn't know I had been waiting for the right moment. And that patience, the long, quiet, deliberate kind that comes from 31 years of holding a needle steady, was the only inheritance I needed.